It's been a terrible week for the now former dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. It all started with a flash strike by revolutionary Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, on December 3rd. In a matter of days, the group had taken Aleppo, which then served as its base for a southward surge into the rest of Syria. Homs fell on December 7th, clearing the way for a push into the Syrian capital of Damascus. And it was only a day later that Assad was escaping the country over which he had ruled with an iron fist, with his tail tucked firmly between his legs. The Assad regime has fallen. And with that fall, Putin's position in Ukraine has been severely weakened. But what does any of this have to do with Russian President Vladimir Putin and his special military operation in Ukraine? It's the fall of a regime in an entirely different country. How could it possibly affect a military campaign thousands of miles away? In this video, we reveal the answers to those questions as we explore why Assad's fall has just cost Russia dearly in its efforts to take Ukraine. But first, what is Syria's former dictator doing right now? We've given you the highlights of his regime's fall already. The lightning-fast HTS attack has seemingly engulfed Syria, putting an end to Assad's 24-year rule. And when we say putting an end, we mean it, as Assad isn't bravely fighting on in Syria to push back the rebels that have taken Damascus. He's gone. Syria's former dictator fled the country after giving his final orders for there to be a peaceful transfer of power in his wake. Those orders clue you in to where Assad has ended up. The relaying of them came from a Russian Foreign Ministry statement released on December 8th, telling you that the Syrian dictator has escaped into the warm embrace of the man who has supported his regime for so long, Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russia, of course, claims that it hasn't been involved in anything related to Assad's departure from Syria outside of giving him a place to stay. It's instead urging all sides within the country to refrain from violence, all while Putin's forces push on in Ukraine. A hypocritical message, but one that's typical of Putin's regime. As for the HTS rebels, they've rightly declared victory over the oppressive Assad regime. In a public post on WhatsApp, the group's senior commander posted, "We declare the city of Damascus free from the tyrant Bashar al-Assad. To the displaced people around the world, free Syria awaits you." Free Syria. There's a combination of words that has seemed impossible for decades of Assad family rule. Social media videos demonstrate what appears to be the mood inside Syria now that Assad has fled to Russia. People dance in the streets waving flags and firing their guns into the air. Passing cars honk their horns while rebels and civilians alike pose for selfies atop the battered carcasses of the Russian tanks Assad used to prop up his fallen regime. It now appears that Syria's future is in the hands of its people. That's according to the country's Prime Minister, Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali, who had served in his role for around 3 months after being appointed by Assad. Unlike his former president, al-Jalali remained in his home as the rebels streamed into Damascus, with HTS stating that he would remain in place as Syria's interim prime minister until a new form of government was created. The prime minister says he doesn't intend to leave his country, except in a peaceful manner that ensures the continued functioning of public institutions and state facilities, promoting security and reassurance for our fellow citizens. He also claims that he's willing and able to cooperate with any government Syria's people install from here. Syria is liberated. Or as US President Joe Biden put it, at long last, the Assad regime has fallen. But by now, you have a burning question. What does any of this have to do with Putin's fortunes in Ukraine? The answer, at least in part, comes from human rights campaigner and vocal Putin critic Bill Browder during a December 8th interview with Times Radio. He lays out exactly what Assad's fall means to the Syrian people. Assad was a brutal dictator who killed more than 500,000 of his own people. He created 10 million refugees. He did this in partnership with Vladimir Putin and Iran, says Browder. Therein lies our first hint about why Assad's fall is so devastating to Putin. Through his propping up of dictators like Assad, Putin has been able to project power around the world, with Syria giving him a foothold in the Middle East. Syria was little more than a client state to Russia, says CNN in its analysis of Assad's collapse. And by losing the man who ran that client state, Putin has suffered a major blow to his desire to be a power broker in the Middle East. Back in Ukraine, the fall of the Syrian regime carries a certain amount of symbolism. As Assad fled to Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stood with President-elect Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron ahead of the reopening of the historic Notre Dame Cathedral following a fire that gutted the famous building in 2019. Why does this matter? On one hand, you have evidence of a Russian regime collapsing by proxy. Putin's imperialistic ambitions are on full display in Ukraine, and he's become ever more reliant on the few partners he has left, Syria included, to prop him up as he exhausts his resources in Ukraine. It was Assad who was among the first to laud the start of Putin's special military operation back in February 2022, calling the campaign a correction of history and a restoration of balance which was lost in the world after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The implication was clear. Putin intended to create a new Soviet Union for which Syria would be a crucial partner. Now, Putin's foothold in the Middle East has collapsed from beneath him, and one of his most vital partnerships has crumbled. In contrast, his enemy, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, is showcasing his ability to win friends with visits like the one to Notre Dame. The message is that Ukraine's partnerships are still powerful and in place, while Russia's are starting to collapse around it. From a pure morale standpoint in Ukraine, Assad's decline will reinforce the belief of Ukraine's troops that they have Russia on the ropes. Why? We can answer that with another question. How come Putin didn't come to Assad's aid to stop HTS in its tracks? Russia has propped up Assad's regime for as long as it's existed, and when HTS started its attack, Russia did step in with a handful of airstrikes that were supposed to counteract the rebel advance. Those strikes didn't work, with Russia only managing to hit a hospital in Aleppo, killing 12 people, and some small targets in the HTS stronghold of Idlib. After that, practically nothing. And the reason for the lackluster response, according to Browder, is that Russia couldn't spare the resources. I don't think it was a conscious decision, Browder tells Time Radio. I think that Putin is basically stretched way too thin. He's devoted all of his military resources to Ukraine. This is very telling in terms of where Putin stands on the resource front in the Ukraine war. Continuing to support Assad would have been vital for Russia's leader, given the Middle Eastern foothold his regime offered Putin in Syria, but he just didn't have what he needed to prevent HTS from steamrolling into Damascus. President Biden backed up that claim on December 8th. He commented that the massive damage that Western-supported Ukrainian troops have inflicted on Russia was the reason why Assad couldn't rely on support from his closest ally. Russia's support for Assad also failed, said the president. And that's because Ukraine, backed by American allies, has put up a wall of resistance against invading Russian forces, inflicting massive damage on them. And as Browder points out, Syria is far from the first time that Putin has been found wanting on the resources front. There were many people who didn't pay attention, but he also abandoned Armenia, where he had a military presence, says Browder. That abandonment led to a split between Armenia and Russia in the summer of 2024, amidst Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan accusing Putin of failing to honor its end of the two countries' deal. It turned out that the members of the alliance are not fulfilling their contractual obligations, but are planning a war against us with Azerbaijan, claimed Pashinyan. So not only did Putin fail to provide the resources his Armenian allies needed, but he also supposedly plans to backstab them in the future. How that's going to work when Russia's military is already so depleted is anybody's guess. And there's more. Browder points out that it's not just military resources on which Russia is running short, it's hybrid warfare tactics, which often include attempting to influence elections in other countries, are also failing. In Moldova, he lost the election, Browder says when referring to Russia's efforts to influence the politics in that country. It looks like Romania didn't work out the way he intended it to, he adds while pointing to Putin running a massive influence campaign in that country. Romania actually halted its presidential elections on December 6th amidst accusations of Russia-led political influence operations. Let's come back to what this means for Ukraine. Putin's special military operation has already been a massive drain on Russia's resources. The stats published by Ukraine's Ministry of Finance lay that bare. Russia has lost over 755,000 soldiers to death or injury since February 2022. More than 9,500 of its tanks are out of commission, along with over 21,000 artillery systems and nearly 20,000 armored vehicles. Every single day in Ukraine brings with it news of more Russian losses. And now, Ukraine knows that Putin is running so low on equipment that he can't even support a dictator who he really wanted to keep in power to serve his Middle East ambitions. Imagine what that means on the morale front for Ukraine. It knows that Russia is running low. The fall of Assad potentially represents a light at the end of the tunnel for the Ukraine war, because it shows that Russia's resource problem is even more extensive than anybody imagined. Putin is having to sacrifice his closest allies to keep his special military operation running. How long will it be before his war machine is forced to grind to a halt? It may not be long before we find out, as Ukraine keeps chipping away at the ever-depleting Russian equipment stocks. If the resources issue exposes how weak Russia really is, the same can be said for the fact that Putin allowed Assad's fall to occur in the first place. He now has egg on his face on the global geopolitical stage. As Browder points out to Times Radio, this is a moment of humiliation for Putin. He put his name behind Assad. He put his resources behind Assad. And now Assad has been humiliated, and I think by extension, Putin has been humiliated. Don't underestimate what this blow to Putin's carefully crafted prestige will mean for him in Ukraine. For over 2 decades, Putin has created this image of himself as the strong man of Russian politics, a man nobody dared cross for fear of his deadly retribution. Remember that Russia's support of Assad's regime was Putin's first major power play against the dominance of the West, away from Russia's former Soviet territory, writes BBC Russia editor Steve Rosenberg. The arrival of Russian troops in Syria in 2015 was supposed to show the West that Putin was a threat to the current world order, and that move gave Russia its Middle East foothold. Assad awarded Putin for his efforts with 49-year leases on a naval base in Tartus and an air base in Hmeimim. Both are under threat now. And with those losses comes a massive hit to Putin's reputation as some sort of all-conquering global force. Russia is resorting to blaming the Syrian army for the collapse of Assad, with state TV news anchor Yevgeny Kiselev pointing out that Russia's priority is what's happening in the zone of the special military operation. In other words, it's the resources problem laid bare. Putin doesn't have what it needs to sustain the reputation he's crafted as a man who can threaten the global structure. In Ukraine, that humiliation will ring throughout the battlefield. Ukraine's forces will be buoyed by knowing that their bravery and sacrifices have put a major dent in Putin's imperialistic ambitions, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world. The shot Putin has taken to his reputation will also make it much harder for him to forge alliances elsewhere. After all, beyond its energy resources, the only thing Putin really has to offer to dictators he supports is his power. With that fading, we may see more situations like that in Armenia and Syria, in which the people Putin supports are either deposed or turn their backs on him. Every loss like that will only strengthen Ukraine as it continues to build its alliances with Western nations and others who oppose Russia. Throw in other humiliations Putin has experienced, such as the Kursk invasion in August 2024 and Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow, and you also have the element of the Russian people seeing their leader as what he truly is. Putin isn't the strong man, he's an authoritarian in crisis, with Syria being the latest example of his failures. Ukraine supporters will take note of that, and may even increase their support knowing that Putin is struggling to maintain his grip. Just as dangerous a prospect for Russia's leader is the possibility that his own people may start to turn against him, as these humiliations combine with massive resource losses to show that Putin isn't as powerful as he seems. All of that is good for Ukraine. So too is the change of tone in President-elect Donald Trump's rhetoric toward the Ukraine war that has resulted from Assad's fall. As Assad clambered through hidden tunnels and escaped to Russia, Trump posted to his Truth Social account to declare that Assad is gone. He has fled his country. His protector, Russia led by Vladimir Putin, was not interested in protecting him any longer, Trump blared. There was no reason for Russia to be there in the first place. They lost all interest in Syria because of Ukraine, where close to 600,000 soldiers lay wounded or dead, in a war that should never have started and could go on forever. Trump went on to call for an immediate ceasefire, noting that Zelensky is willing to make a deal and stop the madness. The entire post reads as a combined call for an end to the Ukraine war and a celebration of Putin's failure in Syria, and that's massive for Ukraine. Browder claims that Trump took a somewhat dismissive tone towards Zelensky prior to Assad's fall. He'd also accused Zelensky of making nasty little aspersions towards him, as recently as September. But if Trump's Truth Social post shows us anything, it's that he appears to be tilting in favor of Ukraine. Trump's meeting with Zelensky and Macron in Paris highlights that, as does his mentions of Zelensky being willing to make a deal. If Ukraine's president plays his cards right, he could use Assad's fall to gain himself a very powerful political supporter. Zelensky was already starting to show his hand toward the end of November. Speaking to Sky News, he suggested that he might be willing to strike a ceasefire deal if the parts of the Ukraine he still controls could be brought under the NATO umbrella. That would allow him to negotiate in a diplomatic way for what Russia has already taken later on down the line. It's not quite in line with what rumors about Trump's peace plan suggest, in which NATO membership will be out of Ukraine's reach for the next couple of decades. But Zelensky's comments show that he's willing to work with Trump on a deal at a time when Putin's leverage has been severely undercut. The fall of Assad makes Russia's leader look weak. If Putin and Zelensky do come to the table, Ukraine's president could use that fact, along with Russia's clear resource problems, to negotiate a better deal for his country. A deal that may even allow him to negotiate for Ukraine's lost territory somewhere down the line. This is all language that will appeal to Trump. So too will the support demonstrated for Zelensky in Paris. Browder says Ukraine's leader received a standing ovation when he entered the hallowed Notre Dame halls, which may have served as a demonstration to Trump that Ukraine is really the side for which he should fight. I think that Trump sometimes needs to see with his own eyes the level of support for Ukraine around the world, and I think that was probably very helpful for Ukraine, for Donald Trump to see that, says Browder. In other words, Trump is seeing Zelensky as being strong, both in character and in support, at a time when Putin is weakened by Assad's fall and his own faltering efforts in Ukraine. Trump is a man who's attracted to strength, and right now, that strength seems to lie more with Ukraine's leader than Putin. Ukraine has also been quick to take advantage of that perceived weakness. In the event of Assad's fall, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry released a statement reading, "Events in Syria demonstrate the weakness of Putin's regime, which is incapable of fighting on two fronts and abandons its closest allies for the sake of continued aggression against Ukraine." This is a message both to Trump and any other nations relying on Putin for support. The wheels are coming off the Russian war machine, and that's not just going to affect Putin on the global front, but it means Ukraine has an opportunity to capitalize on how the rest of the world views Russia's leader as the war in Ukraine trudges on. European Union High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, supports that point, as showcased by her X-post on December 8th. She claimed that the Syrian regime collapse shows the weakness of Assad's backers, Russia and Iran. There's that word again and again. Weak. The very last thing that Putin wants anybody to see him as is the word that's making the rounds throughout the West and within Ukraine. As if to emphasize that weakness, Ukraine is renewing its calls for more weaponry, says Times Radio. It's calling for the final push to deliver the death blow to the Russian army, while also demonstrating its openness to negotiations. In other words, Zelensky is showing that he offers multiple ways to end the war, while Russia can only push more soldiers to their deaths as Putin's regime collapses around him. Make no mistakes about it, Assad's fall has cost Russia dearly. It's exposed the country as one that can't protect its allies, which is something of which the other despots Putin supports will take note. It's also exposed that Russia's resources are far more depleted than some may have thought, as well as highlighted Putin's geopolitical weakness. These are all things that Ukraine can take advantage of. The only question now is, will it? Share your thoughts about the answer to that question in the comments below, along with how you believe Assad's collapse in Syria will affect Russia in the Ukraine war. And as always, thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Civil War is Brewing Inside Russia, or click this other video instead.